We have two speakers today. Our first speaker, most people here will know, is Tom Hickey, who works here at the University of Brighton. And Tom has been instrumental in getting UCU to take a BDF position. Our second speaker is Robert Fine from the University of Warwick. Robert's books include Cosmopolitanism and Democracy and Rule of Law, Marx's Critique of Legal Form, and Labour and Liberation in South Africa. Both speakers are going to speak for around 15 or 20 minutes and then it'll be open to the floor. So our first speaker is Tom.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to develop this argument and to have an opportunity to meet and debate with Robert, whose work I know well. I think that this is a critical issue for this conference, but also an issue that is pivotal, both politically and morally. In some senses, I think it could be described as the pivotal political and moral issue of our time. If the 1970s and the 1980s were the decade in which the central global issue concerning ethics and politics was how to confront the apartheid system in South Africa, then I think that it's the case that the last 2 decades, and probably for the next decade or more, it is this issue of the relationship between Israel and Palestine that is going to be central for all our concerns. Here we have, I think, a political struggle that is unquestionably a struggle between the oppressor and the oppressed, and one in which that struggle is not simply one over discrimination and exclusion, but concerns an attempt, and I put it no weaker and no stronger than this, to extirpate a culture and a people. Not an attempt, notice, to exterminate a people, as in the Nazi genocide against European Jewry, but to eradicate them both as a political entity and as a culture. And one thing I want to do in this talk, in the 15 or 20 minutes that it will take, is to try to develop that argument and demonstrate its truth. But that's not the only consideration, of course, and arguably not the central one for this conference. That issue is about who and what is complicit in this process. And that's not an academic issue solely. At least it's not an academic issue in the scholastic sense, at least in the scholastic sense of that term, but a pointed and poignant political issue. And this because an outcome of this debate, and on the outcome of this debate, hangs the issue of what it is that we should do about it. I have one other prefatory point, I suppose, before making the case. It is that we should not, in this case, as I suppose in any other, rush to judgment, but be careful in reflecting on what it is that we are concluding and what the implications of those conclusions are for what we should do. This is because there is, and I admit it from the start, a contradiction in what I'm about to argue, or at least an apparent contradiction. As students, as scholars, as academics, we are, and not just in a liberal academy as it likes to proclaim itself, committed to the notion of academic freedom. That is, arguably, our prime principle of commitment in our role as academics and scholars, a commitment to academic freedom. So let us be clear. The advocation of a boycott of Israeli academic institutions is unavoidably and inevitably an interference with academic freedom. Hence, we need to resolve or to transcend that contradiction and to know precisely what it is that we are doing. The injustices rained down on the Palestinian people can, of course, no longer be denied by anyone. And I venture to hazard that even Robert will agree with that. From the founding of the State of Israel in 1948 and the systematic ethnic cleansing of Palestinian villages documented by Israeli historians from Benny Morris through to Ilan Pappé and others, through the repeated murderous assaults on Gaza and the construction of the apartheid wall separating Palestinians from their agricultural land in the West Bank and the checkpoints of the West Bank, all evidence is, in that sense, incontrovertible. Beyond that, however, are other features whose political purpose is perhaps less obvious, but no less tangible. The continued and expanding colonization of the West Bank with Israeli Jewish settlements, the protection of settler harassment and intimidation and aggression towards the Palestinians of the West Bank, the construction of Israeli-only road networks in the West Bank, dividing up the territory and making it a disarticulated and therefore impossible future state, roads that are only to be used by Israeli citizens. In other words, constructing the West Bank into what in South Africa would have been described as Bantustans, and the extirpation of a culture that goes with it. This catalogue of injustice is what the Israeli scholar Baruch Kimmerling has described and named as a form of politicide. And I quote him, "A process that has as its ultimate goal the dissolution of the Palestinian people's existence as a legitimate social, political, or economic entity." In July and August last year, for instance, to compound all of that process of politicide, there was the assault on Gaza. Israel killed more than 2,000 Gazans, only 276 of whom were members of armed groups resisting the Israelis, and wounded 11,000 more, while reducing the homes of up to 40% of the population to rubble. Before that, in February 2014, last year, Amnesty International reported that Israel had shown, and I quote the Amnesty International report, "callous disregard for human life" by killing and maiming civilians, including children, dozens of them in the occupied territories in the previous 3 years. Culturally, the formation of the State of Israel required a process of de-Arabization, de-Arabizing the entire area, building on destroyed Palestinian villages, and reconstructing the narrative of the area to delegitimize the Palestinians' claim to possession. David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, appointed indeed a governmental names commission to rename each hill and each river, each town, each village. And I quote Ben-Gurion, "Just as we do not recognize the Arabs' political proprietorship over the country, so also we do not recognize their spiritual proprietorship and their place names. In other words, a cultural apoliticization of the area." The process, of course, continues. In East Jerusalem, Palestinian communities are today displaced to enable the construction of what is called the City of David, a tourist park, believe it or not, that promotes the exclusive narrative of Jewish origins of the city. This process is called today, and has always been called, the Judaization of the area. The siege of the West Bank and Gaza is the military force that enables this cultural politicide to take place. It is the necessary material counterpart to that political process. It is what denies Palestinian artists and cultural workers the right to movement and association across the area known as the West Bank. A denial that is at the whim of those soldiers who are on the checkpoints and the administrators who make the decision. So what to do? Well, one argument is that in the face of this, it is the responsibility of those who recognize what is taking place to engage in their expression of opposition themselves. And the argument here is that the most effective way to do that is to engage in a boycott. And what is the boycott? The boycott is a call from Palestinian civil society to us as academics or to cultural workers, not to cease discussion with our Israeli colleagues, not to boycott individuals, not to target Israelis by virtue merely of the fact that they carry a particular passport, but to boycott the institutions of the state that are directly complicit or indirectly complicit in the processes that I've just described. And that boycott is aimed at particular objectives. Its aim and its objectives in that sense are an attempt to force the Israeli state to comply with international law in respect of the human rights of the population over which that state provides, to comply with international law in respect of the right of return of refugees to their homes. It is aimed at persuading Israel to withdraw from the territories that it is illegally occupying, illegally under the terms of international law, and it is aimed at ending the discrimination against Palestinian citizens of Israel. Some 15 or 16% of the population of Israel are Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel who are systematically discriminated against in terms of welfare, education, politics, etc. Now, some people ask and argue that there is a peculiarity about this call for boycott. Why target Israel? Why not target other states with equally dire human rights records? Well, there are two responses to this that I want to put to you. The first is that in the case of Palestine, we as academics or as cultural workers have in front of us a call from our Palestinian colleagues to do this, to bring this pressure to bear in the interests of their struggle for freedom and for justice, in order to force the Israeli state to comply with international law and to prosecute the road to a peace that is a just peace. Not just the peace of the victor, not just the peace that Israel would like, but a peace that is a just peace. So the first point is that it is a call from Palestinian civil society itself. But second, because we do, in my view at least, have a particular responsibility as citizens of societies and states in the West. Because in the case of Israel, we are speaking of a state that is itself sustained by the support of our governments in the West. And that, it seems to me, imposes a particular responsibility on us. Other countries that are not the friends of our government or our government's objectives, whether they be neoliberal or social democrat or whatever they are, do face sanctions for their breaches of human rights or for their breaches of international law. Zimbabwe is suffering sanctions today. Syria is suffering sanctions today. Russia is suffering sanctions today imposed by the states of the West. But Israel, exclusively Israel, experiences precisely the opposite. In terms of what Israel benefits from in respect of its relationship to the European Union, for example, Israel, despite the fact that it is located in the Middle East, is a de facto member of the European Union, and despite the fact that in respect of the principles on which membership of the European Union is built, Israel systematically defies those principles, yet it benefits from scientific financing and joint projects with countries and academic institutions in the European Union. Since 1948, not on the basis of research, but just on the military hardware that enables Israel to survive and play its role for the United States as a police person state in the Middle East, serving the interests of US foreign policy, Israel has received no less than $234 billion from the United States to keep itself going. And those are the reasons why, for ourselves as citizens of Western states, we have that obligation. Why target universities? Well, let's face it, Israel is an integrated and developed society. It's a society in which no section of that society is separated from the policies of the society in its totality. The universities provide the person power for the Israeli Defense Force, from students and from staff. Much of the advanced research in those institutions is orientated towards the security needs of the Israeli state and its occupation of the West Bank. the high-tech products that are produced in those university departments are tested in the testing ground that is the open prison or the open concentration camp of the Gaza Strip. Haifa's Technikon Institution is entwined with the arms industry of Israel and provides the arms industry with its trained recruits. In Tel Aviv's review of 2008-9, the University of Tel Aviv boasted of 55 ongoing research products and projects for the Ministry of Defense. Part of the Hebrew University is built upon 800 acres of confiscated Palestinian land. And Tel Aviv University is built on the ethnically cleansed Palestinian village of Sheikh Mu'anis. All universities offer special privileges in Israel to the Israeli defense veterans. They have preferred entry. They have dormitories available to them. They have accelerated progress in their degrees, all of which are automatically excluded as advantages offered to the Palestinians. These are not things that are available for Palestinians. And of course, the graduates of those universities, because of the nature of the courses that they do, never question what they then use their talents to provide, or rarely do. Architects build the settlements. Agronomists advise on settlement construction. Doctors, some of them, engage in the justification de facto of torture. Journalists failed to report. Surely we shouldn't be targeting academics because they are sympathetic to the Palestinians. Well, I'm afraid not. Some courageous academics are and stand out, and I think that we ought to salute them, those Israelis who stand out against what is being done in their name. But despite the regret about the violence of their state, despite their chagrin at seeing what is being done to the Palestinians, few Israeli scholars and not one Israeli institution or department has ever aligned itself with the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people. No expression of solidarity with Palestinian academic colleagues suffering the destruction of their the smooth functioning of their academic process in their universities, even though those universities are only a few kilometers down the road. The academic boycott, as I have said, is not directed at individual Israeli academic scholars. It is directed at those institutions that are complicit in it. And the issue, it seems to me, is this, that if this is an argument that takes us onto the terrain of complicity, it is in part a task for us to follow the advice of Foucault in not just speaking about the reality to which we have to adjust, the power of Israel and the difficulty of seeing a way in which the current situation can be changed. It is in part, but only in part, about, following Foucault, speaking truth to power and not relaxing into any concession, making ourselves complicit with what is being done to the Palestinians in the interests of the survival of the Israeli state. But it's only partly that. It is also, it seems to me, about ensuring that having identified what that truth is, we then do not make ourselves complicit in what is going on by failing to act on the knowledge that we have. It is a claim that if it is the case that Israeli institutions are necessarily complicit in the continuing injustices in Palestine, then our continued association with those institutions makes us complicit in those injustices as well. The only way in which I can engage in a conference, for instance, in Israel, the only way in which I can host somebody who is acting as a formal representative of an Israeli institution, the only way that I could publish in an Israeli journal or do a review for an Israeli journal is if I close my eyes to what I know about the complicity of those institutions and I choose to look the other way. And my argument is concluded simply by one sentence. Myopia is complicity too.
This is certainly a very relevant discussion, and I agree with Tom on that for a conference, very interesting conference on complicity and non-complicity. And if I could summarize Tom's argument, I would hear it as we're going to punish the complicity of academic institutions and academics in Israel for what they're doing or for what they're not doing. And we're going to express our non-complicity in saying we'll have nothing to do with them. Now, it's interesting, I think it was in 2005 when my union first brought forward a resolution to boycott Israeli academic institutions. And funnily enough, someone without calling me put me on the list of the to support the boycott. And they put me on the list because I was a critic of the occupation. And when I saw that my name was on the list, I phoned up the person and I said, not happy with it, I don't want to be on the list. And I wasn't quite sure at that time why I didn't want to be on the list, but I didn't. But at the very least, I would have preferred to have been consulted first. And I think over time, what I would like to share with you this morning is just a few of the reasons which were, I think, implicit in my mind at the time, but have become reinforced and more explicit over time. My own feeling is that I agree with Tom in one respect, that this is a really important issue. And my feeling is that the boycott is a kind of tip of a political iceberg. And in getting some clarity on the boycott, we can get clarity on our politics much more generally. I should like to add that I'm slightly buoyed up in my position, unlike, I think, a lot of other commentators, by the recent elections in Israel, where I think it's true, I think this is right, that for the third time, for the third election in a row, the left, I think they're called Zionist bloc, something like that, but the Labour Party and the Left Labour Party and their allies have increased their vote. They've now got and if you put together the Arab bloc and the Zionist bloc, as the two left blocs in Israeli politics, it's about half the vote, half the seats of the Knesset. So I think there's a really interesting situation that's developed in Israel, where about the population politically is split right down the middle, something like 44 to 42 seats. At the moment, the centre parties are supporting the right, but that won't necessarily last. Now, it seems to me that Netanyahu's a very dangerous character and a very slippery character. He'll say one thing today, another thing tomorrow, and he's very threatening towards democracy in Israel, very threatening towards the possibility of an independent Palestinian state. And it's extremely important that the left is able to withstand what Netanyahu's got on offer in the next period. And I think we need to support the left in Israel in doing that. And it does seem to me that the boycott movement, I may be wrong on this, but let's sort of debate it, that the boycott movement is either just irrelevant to that. We need a sort of sense of solidarity, or it's an obstacle to that support, because what tends to happen with the boycott movement is everyone sort of gravitates towards the right. And they say, it's a kind of bunker mentality. And I feel, I mean, we were on the same side, I think, on South Africa. When the new unions were developing in South Africa in the 1980s, very important for the overthrow of apartheid. When the new unions were developing then, they needed all the support they could get. And our response within the trade union movement in Britain was not to say, oh, there's a boycott of South Africa, although we supported boycott of oranges and other things, certainly of gold, and arms, and Land Rovers. But to say, you know, we want to develop links between trade unions, even though they might not share our politics in all kinds of ways, between trade unions in South Africa and trade unions over here. And we tried to develop links at all kinds of levels. And I think that was really important. And actually, those links were opposed by the anti-apartheid movement. The anti-apartheid movement said they were a violation of the boycott. And to my mind, it was disgraceful. You know, the boycott was not aimed at black trade unionists trying to set up. And what they said is, at that time, was that the trade unions were collaborationists. So the boycotts are, I'm not against boycotts at all. I think there's plenty of room for boycott. I strongly supported a boycott in South Africa of Roundtree's when they had a strike, and the union in South Africa was supporting was calling for a boycott of Roundtree's products, of wine gums and so forth. So strongly support that. And I support in Israel, by the way, a boycott of Ariel University in the West Bank. But let me give you very quickly some of the reasons why I think this boycott call is really misguided. The first is I'm not keen on the whole principle of, it seems to me a discriminatory principle, on boycotting members of academic institutions or boycotting academic institutions, university, because of the nationality of that university. It seems to me, whether the nationality is Chinese or Iraqi or Russian or whatever it is, it's quite a wrong principle. In this case, it's Israeli universities. I don't think we should introduce this kind of discriminatory principle into our politics. And I don't think it's helped by what Tom was saying about introducing a sort of political exception. Well, we'll make an exception of people who share our general views. I think we should I'm not sure that we should put ourselves in the position of imposing that kind of political test. I think the whole question of academic boycott, which Tom very honestly raised at the beginning, is an important one. There's something unhealthy in being willing only to hear an echo of our own voices. We've got it's a very complicated dispute, the dispute between Palestinians and, well, it's not only a dispute between Palestinians and Israelis, dispute among Palestinians, between Palestinians, between Israelis, among Israelis, and of course among other Arab states. I mean, the original problem was not just an Israeli-Palestinian problem. It was a problem between Israel, Palestinians, and all the surrounding states. It seems to me that in a very complicated situation like this, we want to hear other voices, and to impose a boycott on Israeli academic institutions is a way of cutting off. It's a way of saying there's something we don't want to hear, and we don't want to speak to. And that seems to me particularly unfortunate. Also, the idea of boycotting a university I mean, these are critical spaces. I mean, think about our universities. Universities aren't sort of political institutions. They don't, on the whole, I belong to Warwick University. They don't take up a fight against the government, you know, and I wish they would, more than they do. And my fellow academics in universities, some are on the left, some are not on the left, you know, they're all kinds. And Israel, I don't think, is that different. But they do provide a space. And I think we should really value that space, not just sort of say, oh, yes, we value it, but then move on to something else. I think we should take that space of critical engagement very seriously indeed. Tom said that Palestinian civil society has called for a boycott. I think that's a half-truth. I mean, certainly there are lots of institutions within Palestinian civil society that have called for a boycott, but the main institution, Palestinian Authority, has not, opposes the boycott. Some do, some don't, but that's the nature of civil society. Palestinian civil society doesn't have one voice and one view. I mean, nor does any civil society. Civil society is a realm of political argument, of political engagement, of people disagreeing, people having lots of different positions. And if you sort of talk about Palestinian civil society in that kind of one voice, kind of populist way, it's a way of diminishing, in my opinion, it's a way of diminishing Palestinian political subjectivity. It's like our own. We don't agree. You and I don't agree here, but we agree on some other things. But it's the same. It's not that Palestinians over there have just one voice, but we over here have a whole sort of symphony of voices. I think it's a way of sort of, it's a kind of compassion for the other that diminishes the other. And we need to recognize, I think, the plurality of civil society. The other thing is, Tom raised the question of why Israel? And I don't think he gave a good answer. Why Israel? Because we give it because the West gives it lots of money. Well, West gives lots of money to Saudi Arabia, to all kinds of places, to Egypt. I'm not sure we should in any of these cases, you know. But if there's a reason to boycott, I don't think, you know, that's a particularly good one. When I was debating this issue, I haven't done it that often, but on another occasion, people said it's because Israel's a democracy. And I don't think that's a very good reason either. I think we just need a better perspective. I mean, the Gaza thing, we've all got our views on, but it's a more complicated issue than I think Tom was making out. You know, it's not as if everything is just one-sided, that Israel is a sort of guilty principle. And then the manifestation of that guilt is it attacks Gaza, you know, because it feels like it, because it's got a bloodlust or something. It wasn't like that. And I think Tom knows it wasn't like that. I think we need a bit of perspective. I mean, 2,000 too many people were, civilians and soldiers were killed in Gaza. It's 2,000 too many, in my view, and I don't underplay that. But we have to remember that on its borders, something like 200,000 people have been killed in Syria, just to keep some perspective on the whole thing. And we have to remember that Palestinians in Syria have been killed in tens of thousands by the Syrian government. Now, I don't know what we want to draw from that, but we need to keep some kind of judgment, some kind of bigger picture in our mind. I think a further reason, I think what the boycott has done, the call for the boycott has done, is that because they're not good reasons for targeting Israeli universities, which are the main source of dissent in Israel, as a matter of fact. Because they're not good reasons for targeting Israeli universities or Israeli orchestras or Israeli theatre groups. What's tended to happen is wilder and wilder, more hyperbolic depictions of how evil Israel is have been constructed precisely to justify the boycott. So it's like first you act and then you find a justification for the act. So we've got the boycott, so there has to be a good reason, and the way that good reason is constructed is through what we're very used to in a way. It's through showing that Israel is the guilty party. So instead of any kind of intersubjectivity between Israel and its surrounding countries, or Israel and Palestinians, and the problems that is involved in that, Israel is the guilty party. And I think, you find depictions of Israel as an apartheid state, depictions of Israel as treating the Palestinians like the Nazis, or you get the sort of wild things like Israeli relief workers in Haiti stealing the body parts of sort of wild accusations which sort of float around like that. And I think that's very much tied up. It's not caused by, but it's tied up with the boycott. Final point I think I've got time to make is that every time, I never understood it at first, but every time a boycott resolution has come to my union, it's come with the accompaniment to say it is not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. And I found that very peculiar, because I never thought it was anti-Semitic, and I don't know anyone else who thought it was anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. But it always came with that. It always came with that, criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. But criticism, of course, is not. You can criticize Zimbabwe, criticize India, criticize Britain for its involvement in Iraq. Well, I mean, none of that is political criticism. But we surely know that criticism of any country can be racist, and criticism of Israel can be anti-Semitic. I mean, people in South Africa, when I used to do work there, criticized Zimbabwe because they said, not because Mugabe was a dictator, but because they said that Africans didn't know how to rule themselves. That was a racist criticism of Zimbabwe. People criticize India, I've seen, for not because of a particular political system, but because they say Indian values are, fundamentally authoritarian or something like that. Of course, criticism of any country can be racist or can be anti-Semitic. And I think one of the dangers of the boycott is that it's led people to say, to discount the very possibility that something could be anti-Semitic. So it's not that, it is or isn't, we don't know, we'd have to investigate, we'd have to discuss, but it's to say, this is not. So you immediately declare a negative. And I think we wouldn't do that in any other case of racism. You know, if someone said they feel that there's some racist stuff going on, in any other case of racism, we'd take that seriously. And we'd say, okay, if you feel it, you may be right, you may be wrong, but we will respond to that feeling. But with the case of anti-Semitism, I think one of the problems is that people say, rightly or wrongly, you know, and I sometimes feel it, but sometimes don't, you know, some anti-Semitic stuff going on. But it's sort of ruled out from the beginning. And not only ruled out, it's sometimes said, well, you're only raising it for, you know, for your own political reasons, for your own, you're trying to protect Israel. No, I'm not. I'm worried about anti-Semitism here. So I think that sort of denial, you know, it's almost like a psychological denial, is politically very dangerous because it creates a whole sort of, I mean, you know, we know that the left has had a very checkered history when it comes to the whole question of anti-Semitism. We don't want to repeat that now. And it's a way of saying, you know, it's a way of saying we won't take that seriously. This is one kind of racism that we won't really address. And I think I've said enough. I'll stop there and open it to discussion.
Okay, the floor is now open for discussion. Can I remind people to be brief, and someone has made your point, don't need to make it again. So, yourself.
Thank you very much. It's just a quick question. Actually, I wanted to thank you very much, both of you, for opening my eyes. Mr. Hickey, can I ask for a correction here? I know I'm guilty of oversimplification, but I need to know why, I guess. I've always, since I read Amy Goodman probably, taught me that $30,000 per annum per head is devoted from the United States to military operation in Israel. And then I thought, okay, that shows me that Israel is really a colony of the United States and wouldn't exist, wouldn't be in persistence except for US interests in oil. And all the religious dogma about chosen people and stuff is simply ideology to cover up what's essentially a military occupation by the United States in the Middle East. Could you correct me if that's wrong? I mean, surely that's an oversimplification.
I think I might take a few and then get someone to come back because there's quite a few hands up. Okay, Bob.
Yeah, two quick interrelated points. One for you, Robert. You said that you were against boycotting universities.
Yes.
But you also said you supported a boycott of Ariel College, which
Yes.
is a university. And I think that it would be good to expand on that a little bit. Secondly, in a way, a point of information, something that hasn't yet been said. I think we need to think about the explicit role of universities in Israel and why the boycott against universities is particularly important because, for instance, Israeli colleagues have to take study leave every 3 years. That study leave has to be taken outside Israel. This is not some sort of innocent largesse on the part of the Israeli state. It's pure ideology. And I think that is one very good reason for taking the boycott of universities extremely seriously. I think there's good reasons for other things as well. But I think there is a parallel between the actual structural role of universities in Israel and cricket and rugby in South Africa all those years ago.
Okay, I'll take one more and then we'll get the speakers to come back and then I'll take another tranche.
So I was just thinking about the nature of academic activity. If the nature of academic activity is fundamentally about the development and exchange of ideas and debate, then my worry would be that a boycott of Israeli academic institutions amounts to silence as much as anything on the part of academics elsewhere, a sort of refusal to sort of develop ideas, engage in debate. And my worry is that silence about issues in other contexts can amount to complicity of a bad kind. So I wonder how we might avoid that.
Okay, if Tom and Robert want to come back on those, and then I'll take another round.
On the question of Israel and its subventions from the United States, $30,000 a head, you say, I have not done that arithmetical calculation, but certainly the Israeli state couldn't survive without the military support and aid money that comes from the United States. That's certainly true. Whether it was appropriate then to describe Israel as a colony of the United States, I doubt. I would argue that it isn't. Israel is a different kind of thing. If you wanted comparator, I think the closest comparator would be the position of French Algeria when Algeria claimed ownership of France, because that wasn't a colony in the straightforward sense of the British in India. This was a colon people who were living there, who were born there, who identified themselves as Algerian, but Algerian French. And in the case of Israel, I think you've got a comparable situation. It is settler colonialism, in the sense that the people, the large majority of the Israeli citizens who are settled there and treat that as their home, not as a colony to go and exploit and then to return to the metropolitan country, or in this case to the United States later. That's not the case. And that makes a big difference. It makes a big difference, for instance, because though the Israeli state is heavily dependent on the United States, it would be a mistake to simply think that this is a dog on a leash, that the United States has a hound dog, a guard dog, which it can let off every now and then against its enemies in the Middle East. It's a little bit different, or it needs to be thought of as this is an unruly hound dog. Because it's a settler colonial state rather than a colony, it sometimes tries to bite the hand of the person holding the leash. And that's why you have tense relationships between some United States governments and the Israeli government at different periods. So I think it is a much more complicated issue like that, but I think the underlying point is the case. Israel couldn't exist without the support of major powers, and hasn't existed since 1948 without the support of first of the European countries, colonial countries, and then the United States of America, and couldn't survive now without the subventions from the United States, even though it's developed the unlawful 100+ nuclear weapons that it has. It would implode without it. So I think it is a slightly more complicated question than simply seeing it as a colony of the United States. Doesn't boycott lead to silence? Well, actually the paradox is, and this is partly in response to a point that Robert made earlier, I think the reverse is true. Since the debate about boycott started first in 2005 and then culminated in our trade union, the lecturers' union, the UCU, in 2010, when the union took a position in favor of boycott, disinvestment and sanctions, including the academic boycott, the contacts between critics of Israel, even trenchant critics of Israel, those who criticize the very idea of a Zionist state, and Israeli colleagues, has escalated dramatically, and not just arithmetically, but zoomed ahead, because now there is a great concern that silence will be closed off. The second point is, the boycott is not in favor of silence between Israeli scholars and scholars overseas. The whole point is to bring to the attention of Israeli scholars what is being done in their name, and to suggest to them that that's intolerable. And this is not about, and again to answer one of the points that Robert made in his speech before, this is not about discriminating against the scholars with whose political views you disagree. The boycott call from our Palestinian colleagues makes it absolutely explicit that this should not target individuals, and you should not distinguish between individuals with whom you engage on the basis of their political views. So someone who is in favor of the occupation and the annexation of the West Bank to Israel, which is what Netanyahu's government is now making much more likely, even such a person, someone who's a trenchant Zionist, an expansionist Zionist, should not be discriminated on the basis of that view. If he's an individual Israeli scholar, he should not be targeted, or she should not be targeted. It's only if the individual is coming formally to represent their institution, so that they are coming and saying, I'm here to represent the University of Haifa. Of course, anybody who comes, who works for the University of Haifa, will actually be funded to come here by the University of Haifa. But again, the boycott says that's not representing the university. It's only if they stand up or appointed or named as the representative of the university, then they are subject, according to the call of our Palestinian colleagues, to target. So this isn't about silencing. Actually, the boycott is about the reverse. It's about opening up a debate that otherwise would be closed down.
Colony of the United States. I get a bit confused by the sort of settler colonialism argument, because settler colonialism, it doesn't sort of ring true to me. Settler colonial was used as a description of America, of Canada, of Australia. I don't think Israel's really like those situations. And I don't think we'd have much disagreement there. I mean, a lot of the original people we know who went to Israel either came from Europe to escape, or they came from the Middle East to escape. And a lot of people, came from Egypt, from Iraq, from Syria, from Morocco, from Algeria. Those are the sort of two main groups. I'm not sure that the word settler colonialism really captures that experience. It doesn't quite for me. There's something else going on there. Now, that's a long time ago, and things have changed and things have moved on. But the relation between Israel and the United States is not dissimilar to the relation between some other countries in the United States, and I don't particularly want to defend it. But I also don't want to, think that somehow the tail is wagging the dog here. It seems to me that it's quite there's sort of images of Israel of running American military and foreign policy, which seems to me completely off the mark. Universities in Israel, the Ariel thing, the reason I'm not quite sure, to be honest. I don't have a sort of definitive answer, but the main reason why I'd support Ariel is support the boycott of Ariel is that it's called for by unions in Israel who thought that, and this is sort of my notion of solidarity, not that we tell people over there what they should do or what they should think, or if they're not for a boycott, then they're sort of not good enough. But we should basically, that solidarity is about supporting independent sort of labor movement and similar, and women's movement and community organizations in Palestine and Israel. And what I would support on the academic side is, I'd support what we can do to support academic links, support academic freedom of Palestinians, and support access to universities, there are already a lot of Palestinian academics in Israeli universities, support more, there should be more, and not enough yet. And that's the kind of thing that we should be going for, and for opening up, doing what we can to support links between Palestinian and Israeli academics so they can talk to each other. On the silence thing, well, I sort of welcome what Tom said on a very rather restricted notion of what the boycott is. It's not, so if someone comes over on government funding from Israel, like I go somewhere else on government funding from Britain, or you do, that wouldn't be, included in the boycott. I welcome that sort of restricted notion, but I think part of the problem with the whole boycott is it's very kind of vague. Everyone I talk to has a different notion of quite what the boycott includes and excludes. And it seems to me, maybe, I mean, this is something we could argue more, that if you set up a boycott of an institution, to think that it's not going to affect the individual members of that institution is not right. Of course it affects the individual members of the institution, and it makes it, if nothing else, it creates an atmosphere that you're not welcome here. But it could be more than that. It could be someone says, oh, we're not going to have Israelis on our board, or we're not, whatever. And in terms of debate and silencing, I don't know. I mean, I can only speak, I would speak on my experience in UCU. And I think, what happened, maybe it'll change over time. These things are not sort of written in stone. But what's happened is there's a kind of boycott orthodoxy that emerged, and it's been actually very difficult to speak against it, and there's been a hell of a lot of abuse that's thrown at people who've spoken against it. And often it's been very difficult. And I remember you, Tom, standing up. I was at the meeting. Standing up and saying, and your first words when you got up, there's probably 5 of us in a room full of 1,000 or something who opposed the boycott. And your first words are, we're not going to be intimidated by this sort of Israel, I don't know what Zionist, we're not going to be intimidated, as if, the 5 of us in this room full of 1,000 were the source of an intimidation. I thought it was, wrong. It was a way of sort of, preventing speech, not facilitating speech.
Paul? I just want to pick you up on your politics. If we accept some of your complexities, complexity then breeds inertia, and you have nothing to say. Yeah, you have nothing to say against the immiseration of ongoing people. The claim of antisemitism, which the Israeli state, Israeli spokesman, and the Organisation of Israel Fund for Friendship across Europe make that claim. Well, if we were to spend all our time saying, have you got the right motives, I'm quite sure, again, it will produce inertia in the immiseration of a people. We can be trusted to know when there's racists alongside. And the idea we wait for a union to say, come and boycott my university, if someone's kicking someone in the teeth, I don't wait for that person whose teeth are being kicked out before I step in. It's quite legitimate to say, enough is enough, this is wrong, we stand for something. So I'm a bit concerned for all the points you make, some of which are interesting, that in the end all you have to offer us is inertia while people starve and die.
Yeah, thank you. I want to go back to your point where you said boycotting universities could in fact hinder the parliamentary left, which would hinder the fight altogether. Can we fairly suggest that the problem runs deeper than that can be solved on a purely parliamentary level, which I think could have been what Tom was getting at. By targeting the universities, you're in fact targeting key institutions that are upholding the structure, because universities are in fact political. So do you think it's a structural issue, and therefore it has to be a structural solution, or a purely parliamentary issue that can be solved by a different political policy?
I'd like to ask a question about the construction of the idea of anti-Semitism in this context, because I had the interesting experience of attending a conference in Israel with approval of Medical Aid for Palestine and their Palestinian affiliate, because this was a conference organized by UNESCO, one of a series of 10 which happen almost every year in Israel, on medical ethics education. And Tom may be interested to know that Yoram Blasher was the scientific secretary, this is one of the leading apologists for Israeli torture, medic. And so the first question one is, I was accused of anti-Semitism, and bear in mind I was somewhat perplexed as the offspring of refugees from Nazi Germany and the pogroms after 1905, as a, quote, self-hating Jew. There appears to be an industry for the generation of such perceptions, and in the medical field it takes the interesting form of a huge attempt to get the editor of The Lancet fired by the Zionist protection industry, if you like, as a result of an article which he published. So the question, who is trying to suppress academic freedom, may become relevant. Thank you.
Right, Tom and Robert, do you want to come back to those questions? And you want to come back to?
A couple more?
Okay, a couple more.
Just,
Sure.
If there are.
Yep. Any more indications? That's surprising. Well, while you're... yes, there.
Yeah, I just wondered if you could expand, Robert, a little bit on what you were saying about Egypt and them receiving funding. I'm not sure how I see that's particularly relevant to this sort of discussion at all.
Yes, we know we've mentioned the Palestinian voice and calling for a boycott, but we haven't really heard of what the Israeli scholars, is there a forum or a place for their voice, our Israeli colleagues, on the question of the boycott?
Okay. So I'll ask Tom and Robert to come back on those, and then if people indicate, we can do one more round of questions.
Should I go for? Can I start with the parliamentary question, which I think is a good one. I kind of agree with the force behind the question there. I wouldn't want to suggest that if, what's his name, Herzog, had got into power, that everything it all would have changed tomorrow. I think that's, it would face the same problems in ending the occupation that, that exists now. Nothing would have changed in a way. But we'd just be in a stronger position to at least address these questions. So I kind of agree that parliamentarism by itself is not enough. I think there's a very interesting civil society, both in Palestine and among Israelis, that often doesn't get political expression. And I think it's very rich, but in terms of women's movements, human rights movements, anti-occupation movements. I think it's very rich. I think, if you ask me, if things don't look good in the Middle East at the moment, there's communal strife all over the place. The boundaries between states have become extremely porous in the worst possible ways. There's violence, there's terrible violence, and states have become weaker. In some cases, have almost completely disintegrated. And Israel's, in the middle of all that. So, it's not as if those problems are going to go away because of a parliamentary vote in favor of a sort of centre-left in Israel. But I think at least there'll be a possibility to address issues and not to have this sort of slippery talk that Netanyahu gives us, and a very aggressive talk as well. On the self-hating Jew thing, I didn't quite understand. I couldn't hear, to be honest, the whole thing. I find it sort of interesting because I sort of come from that circuit in a way. But I sometimes get uncomfortable with the role of left-wing Jews of saying, it's all right to give a kind of imprimatur, a kind of authority, and saying it's okay to boycott Israeli academics and only Israeli academics of all the world's academics. It's because, we can tell you this is a sort of political critique, and it's not anti-Semitism, and it's not anything wrong. And I don't think it's captured by any notion of self-hatred, but I think there is something problematic about the role, people rather like myself sometimes, who, of left-wing Jews who want to say that whatever you say about Israel, however outlandish, and it's the Jewish state that's the wrong state, that's fundamentally wrong, fundamentally unacceptable, whatever you say about that. And it has to be overcome, and it has to be gotten rid of, and so on. I think there's something problematic about the particular role of some left-wing Jews in saying that that's fine, that's sort of legitimate political criticism. So I'd like some more consideration on that. On the Egypt question, yeah, it's not really. Who was it who asked that? You're right. It's not particularly relevant here, except to say, that Israel is by no means the only country that America funds very highly. But what conclusion we draw from that, I haven't really gone into.
I think the only thing that I want to respond to is the question about Egypt, because I think that, unlike Robert, and possibly unlike yourself, I think it is relevant. And I think that the relevance lies in this, that who would be those who would be opposed to the financial support for the new Egyptian unlawful government as a result of the coup? And who would be in favour of them? Who would be in favour of British support and the recent military agreement to supply arms and equipment to the Egyptian military? Answer: Israel. And Israel's supporters and the opponents of the boycott of Israel would support Britain's relationship with Egypt. Who would be opposed to it and who is opposed to it? I think all those. Every last person who is in support of the boycott has taken a conscious decision to be in favour of the academic and cultural boycott of Israeli institutions. Every single such person would be opposed to the supplying of arms and financial aid to the Egyptian military under the circumstances, and I think that tells us an awful lot. Okay, this is the last round of questions, so if people indicate, I'll have a sense of how many we have. Okay, you see, now you all want to talk. Trish.
It's very short, actually. It's not even a question, it's more in the line of a comment. Because I'm struck by the way in which universities get spoken about in context to do with the academic boycott. I'm a supporter, a reluctant supporter, I could say most supporters are, of the academic boycott. And one very, very powerful reason for me is the nature of the work that Israeli universities do in the material and the symbolic reproduction of the Israeli state and the things that it does. So in many, many ways, it's a very, very fundamental. These are institutions that are tied up structurally. It's a complicity that's not a matter of individuals and their motivations. It's a structural complicity, if you want to use that term. When people say that, is it not better to keep a dialogue open with these precious spaces of dissent, I find it very hard to think of those universities as spaces of dissent. I find it impossible to think of those universities as spaces of dissent. But I also find it, and I think it'd be wrong not to say this, I find it really hard to think of our universities as spaces of dissent. I don't think they ever have been. Now, the forms in which they have failed to be spaces of dissent have altered over time. But if we look at what's going on now in our universities, and if we look previously at previous moments where universities could have played a particular role, for example, in women's rights and civil rights and so on. Quite often they're pulled screaming and shouting into places to do some good. So I think we need to get it right in our minds what we're talking about when we're talking about universities. An academic boycott immediately has something that there's something so precious about academic work. There's something so precious about the type of work that goes on inside universities that we can't possibly interfere with that in any way. But who are we fooling?
Nice.
I can't talk about it. Okay. But I thought maybe it would give us more to argue about if we were more clear about what exactly we think the objective of boycotts are in general. Because so far I've heard us say different things about what the objective of a boycott in general would be. So is a boycott a way to force people to the table? Is a boycott a way to remove our support from something that we would otherwise be supporting? And I think it was also mentioned that a boycott would be a way to make scholars in Israel aware of their own complicity. So I guess my question is just, what is it? What would be the primary reason for undertaking a boycott in this or any other circumstance?
I take it that, that you would both agree that what's happening is kind of unspeakably wrong, politicized. I'd accept all of your characterization of what's happening to the Palestinians. But I take it also that you would both agree on the necessity to speak to that, as it were, to speak against it in some way, but to speak to it. So I guess my question is there an alternative to a boycott? And if there is, what would that look like? How would one think about that?
Thank you. Dina.
It's to Robert. You've made two points against boycott that are on the basis or on the claim that we don't know. There's things that we don't know. And I'm surprised that you would come here to this debate without that knowledge. The two points are, one on Israeli scholars who are in favor of the boycott, and in fact, many of them who have, and there's voices that we've heard there, there's knowledge about that, and many of them have said that in fact that boycott helps them in their position in putting pressure on the state, on Israel. So, and these are known. And the second point is on, you were saying we don't know we don't hear voices from neighboring Arab countries and what they are saying about that. And that's also not true, because at least since the 70s, at least since some of the states have decided to make peace agreements with Israel, we've heard a lot of dissenting voices from neighboring Arab countries, especially from the ones that have signed peace agreements. And there's a clear and articulate point that is being raised all the time. It's against normalizing relations with Israel. The point of normalizing relations is not new knowledge, and I'm surprised that you would make two claims without such knowledge, or muffling knowledge available.
Thank you. Anthony?
Hi Robert, I just want to push you on what I think Paul and Frank were sort of alluding to with regards to your claim that critique of Israel is anti-Semitic, but if you say we're not anti-Semitic, that's somehow kind of silencing genuine investigations into racism. I accept that point, but I think what they were saying is that there's a funded industry that constantly acts to try and silence critique and dissent, a funded body of really powerful industry, and I don't think you really address that. So you're slightly being disingenuous, I felt, by putting that forward as if that's the problem, that now the issue of anti-Semitism can't be addressed, because it comes from Israel, doesn't it? The accusation. It's got to this state now where Judith Butler, for example, is not only denying she's anti-Semitic, she's denying she's a member of Hamas, right? So that's how extreme it has got, that she, and as she says, it's highly unlikely for a gay post-structuralist to be a member of Hamas. I know that's, but it's a really serious point I'm making that I don't think you really address.
Right, I'm going to ask the speakers to come back and to sum up as well, so maybe about 5 minutes, or possibly 7 minutes each. So, Robert, given most of the questions were for you, maybe you want to go first?
Okay. I think academic freedom, who was it who asked that question? Academic freedom is an important value. Like all important values, it's not an absolute value. There are circumstances I can envisage in which we would suspend academic freedom. I don't think those circumstances, I mean, I was supporting a call from Israeli scholars, Palestinian and Jewish, if you want, for boycott of Ariel. I think there are circumstances in which we do so, but I think we need to. I think universities, nonetheless, both in Israel and here, which are probably quite similar in some ways, both full of conformity, compliance, complicity, if you want. I think, you know, there's a sense in which they play a very important critical role, despite all that. I mean, I was a graduate student at Columbia University in New York at the time when Columbia University had a weapons development laboratory that I think basically invented Agent Orange that was used in Vietnam. And that had to, there was no academic freedom for that in my view. That had to be closed down. That was absolutely nothing to do with academic freedom. But I don't think Columbia should have been closed down. I think that the pressure should have been, you know, and if in some Israeli university there was a similar sort of thing, I'd be absolutely in favor of closing that down. I think the most sort of the really key question that's been raised is this question of what's the objective of the boycott. I think that's the key question, and it's not. I mean, boycott's a weapon, you know, and you use it under some circumstances. You don't use it under others, and I think, you know, from my point of view. You know, you've got a very sort of difficult national conflict, which neither of the parties, in my opinion, was responsible for. You know, if I'd put responsibility on it, I would look back to the British colonialism, and then I'd look back to the sort of disastrous beginnings of the Israeli state. With, you know, a war between Israel and all its neighbors. If the Palestinians were, you know, no one thought about the Palestinians, and no one. The only people who supported a Palestinian state then were the Zionists, funnily enough. They supported a Palestinian state in the United Nations, but it was completely rejected by all these surrounding states. You know, and that's created huge problems. But I think, you know, to my mind, the question of what the objective of whatever we do, it's a national conflict, and we should be looking for a resolution of that national conflict, not for just taking one side and saying that's got innocence and all right on it, and the other side has guilt and all wrong on it. And I think we should be looking for resolution. And I think that, you know, the resolution, we know what it has to be. It has to be an independent Palestinian state. That we know. And there has to be an end to occupation, and it has to be an end to the human rights abuses that flow from that occupation. So it seems to me very clear, but the question is, you know, if you simply vilify Zionism and see it as a dirty word, or say it's like apartheid, and, you know, or it's like Nazism, or whatever analogy you want to draw up, you know, it's not a way of reaching any resolution. It's a way of saying we're going to destroy that side, and then the whole world and everything will be fine. Sure, you know, get rid of Israel and everything will be fine in the Middle East, to be sure. So I think the objective is peace, and the objective is peace and justice. And we kind of know the terms on which that can be reached. The question is what we can do usefully, not just to make ourselves feel better by being non-complicit. I mean, if you take, say, the issue of anti-Semitism, seems to me the first victims of anti-Semitism are never the Jews, actually. In the Middle East, the first victim of anti-Semitism, of anti-Semitic parties within Arab society, the first victims are other Arabs, other Muslims, and and the same in Europe, actually. I don't think the Jews are the first victims. So the question of objectives is absolutely crucial. I think the whole question of normalizing relations to Israel, I mean, it's a really big one. And I think my own view is that the normalization of relations with Israel, what does that mean? But, one thing it should mean is that when we look at the Arab Spring, it seems to me that the Arab Spring was about democracy and against corruption, against militarism, and for human rights under different dictatorships in the Middle East, and that had nothing to do with Israel as such. And I think in that sense, it's a fight for democracy. And if we mean by normalization a fight for democracy, then I'm in favor of it.
Well, I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do and respond to all the points that I've made a note of, rather than making rhetorical flourish. I'm not well known for making rhetorical flourish. Robert said when he was speaking that there was at least one thing that he agreed with me about, and then he proceeded to disagree, I thought, with everything that I said, but maybe not. We can talk about that later. But I do want to make a similar kind of claim, having heard what he said. I, too, like him, was buoyed up by the result of the Israeli elections and the return of Netanyahu and his accomplices. I was, however, buoyed up by it for, I suspect, significantly different reasons to those that caused Robert to celebrate it. And I was buoyed up by it because I think that it underscored once and for all the absurdity of the suggestion that somehow the Israeli state was negotiating over the detailed terms of a future Palestinian entity which might have statehood. It ruled it out of account. It made it quite clear. Nobody should have had any doubt about that if you'd followed the WikiLeaks and the other revelations about Israeli negotiations over the peace process. You should have known that there's never been any intention. It's always been a process of dragging that out until it goes away entirely and facts on the ground make it impossible. And indeed, those facts on the ground now largely do make it impossible. I mean, if Israel was built on the basis of ethnic cleansing, which it was, how would you now create an independent Palestinian state on the West Bank without engaging in a process of ethnic cleansing of the hundreds of thousands of Jewish settlers who are there? And nobody, I would have hoped, in this room, and certainly the Palestinians who are in favor of the academic boycott of Israel, are in favor of the ethnic cleansing of Jews, either from the West Bank or from Israel in the pre-1967 borders. So in that sense, what Netanyahu has done is just declared to the world what anybody who followed the issue from the start knew already, that the peace process in that sense has been dead in the water from the moment of its announcement. Robert also spoke about being in support of calls from legitimate bodies for solidarity, and he made reference to the way in which he would be responding positively for the call for solidarity, boycott-type solidarity from trade unions. But that's not coming from Israel. Well, how would it come from Israel? The dominant trade union in Israel is the Histadrut, and the Histadrut is not a trade union in the proper sense. I mean, it is, I think, the third largest owner of capital investment in the state. It's an association that claims to be a trade union, purports to be a trade union, but is in part is in fact part of the Israeli state. Robert argued that to boycott is discriminatory if it's based on nationality. But hold on, it's not based on nationality. That's not what the boycott is targeting. It's boycotting the institutions of a state that are engaged in discriminatory practices. In the case of South Africa, the South African boycott was not aimed at the South African nationals who would suffer from it. It was aimed at the apartheid state, not the South African whites, the coloureds, or the blacks in South Africa. It was aimed at the institutions of apartheid, just as the current claim for a boycott in Israel is aimed at them. Why Israel? Because Israel is the beneficiary of major subventions from our governments, and that gives us a particular responsibility, and because there has been the call from Palestinians for the solidarity. Robert says that Gaza is a more complicated picture than I gave reference to or pictured for you. It's a more complicated picture, he says. Well, in terms of its origins, of course it's more complicated. What isn't more complicated is that 2,000 died, 11,000 were killed, of whom only 273 or 4, whatever the number was, were actually armed fighters, and in circumstances in which the claim was made that this is in response to the Palestinian rockets, homemade rockets, notice. And I don't justify, I'm not engaged in the justification of firing rockets at Israeli towns and settlements either. But notice, the claim is made in response to homemade rockets. But where did the homemade rockets come from? And I don't mean what was the logistics of the supply. I'm asking why it was that armed groups associated with Hamas and those not associated with Hamas were firing them. It's because Gaza had been turned into an open-air concentration camp in which people were being culturally and politically suffocated, in which the borders were closed, and the only way of making any change was to try and force the Israelis to confront this, and that was the source of the rockets. Notice how politics and political explanation often turns on a temporal question. If your explanation starts in year X, your account of what's going on is fantastically different. Fantastically different. If your accounts start in year X minus 5. In other words, the temporal ambit of your explanation actually determines the outcome. Boycott is not based on the claim that Israel is evil. That's not the claim. Evil is a religious confessional expression. I know what it means as a historical object emerging out of various confessional declarations of belief in God and devils, but I don't engage in a political analysis that generates the concept of evil. The object of the boycott is a political project called Zionism, which in its manifestation in Israel-Palestine is an exclusory, discriminatory, and expansionary system. That's the object of the boycott, not the generalized notion of evil. I'm very glad that Robert, wasn't accusing me of anti-Semitism, or saying that those in support of boycotts are eo ipso anti-Semitic. But he also says, notice, and he also raises the question of anti-Semitism. And he raises it in this interesting and sophisticated way, declaring that he knows nobody who accuses those in support of the boycott of being anti-Semitic. Robert, I think you do. If you don't, I'll name the names of people whom you know, and I know. Your friend Ronnie Fraser, who shares a union membership with yourself and myself, has accused not only individual members, he hasn't accused me personally, but individual members, he's accused also his own union, the UCU, of being anti-Semitic. Robert raises the question and suggests that one of the problems about the boycott is that it silences talk about anti-Semitism. Well, I think that that's the reverse, and I'm glad that I'm engaged in the debate, because when I was in the leadership of the union and playing the role over the boycott that I played in the union, I happened to be the person who organized the UCU's first conferences, what was it, 6 or 7 years ago on anti-Semitism, which subsequently have been repeated on an annual basis in the commemoration of the Holocaust. I'm also the author and editor of the UCU's pamphlet on anti-Semitism today, which does in part differentiate anti-Semitism from anti-Israel sentiment or from anti-Israeli policy sentiment, but it was a pamphlet about the rise of anti-Semitism today and the ways in which it is partly similar, but importantly different from the nature of anti-Semitism in the 1920s and 1930s in Europe. And of course it's true, you can get people who are in support of the boycott who are indeed anti-Semites. And that was repeated at our conference again and again, that there is a danger in arguing for this, that it will recruit anti-Semites to its side. But no serious struggler for justice in Palestine or the defender of the boycott is going to tolerate being associated with an anti-Semite. And even the raising of the question of anti-Semitism in that sense is dangerous unless complete distance is put between oneself and the very suggestion that merely to criticize Israeli policy or even to criticize Israel is in itself anti-Semitic. Robert says that the central question is what the boycott's about, and somebody else raised the question about what precisely it's about. It is not vague. It is highly precise. Those who want to argue that it is vague, either they haven't bothered to find out about it and gone to the literature, and that's understandable. If people are new to the issue, then they wouldn't know. But if you're not new to the issue, then you've got no excuse for suggesting that it's vague. It's highly precise. It's targeted at institutions. There is an enormous characterization of what is and what is not boycottable, according to what the Palestinian Campaign for the Cultural and Academic Boycott of Israel thinks is legitimate. Very, very detailed, saying under no circumstances target individuals. We must not set ourselves up as the judge and jury on the legitimacy of a person's political views or what. This is about targeting the institutions that are complicit. And what's its objective? Now that's an extraordinarily good question, because there is one sense, I have to admit, that its objectives might be seen to be vague, because it has multiple objectives at the same time. On the one hand, it is about expressing solidarity. It is about declaring what the truth is in that relationship between truth and power. It is about that. It's also about trying to create an atmosphere in which it is more likely that future Israeli governments will come to some kind of negotiating position with the Palestinians, at least sit down and discuss the issue with Palestinians in a way that they never have hitherto. In other words, not behind the scenes saying we're going into these negotiations for the sake of our image in the world. That's what it's about. And it's about, and this is why, of course, 99% of Israelis will never agree with it, and 99% of Zionists will never agree with the boycott claim. It is about recognizing international law. And it's one particular aspect of international law that is the touchstone for this. And that's the right of return of refugees to their home. The right of return of refugees from their home means the refugees in the camps, into which they poured after they were ethnically cleansed from Palestine in 1948 and 1967 and throughout all the various wars. And that's why, that's the big issue, and the issue that cannot go away. This conflict will never be resolved until Palestinian refugees have the right to return. I was going to speak, and I haven't, Chair stopping me, I was going to speak about the fact that the boycott is successful. It is successful, but I'll just say this. It's not being successful as a final full stop. And we got one dramatic example of it already. And I hope that Robert will be the first, despite the fact that we disagree on the question of Zionism and Israel and the boycott, to agree with me on this. I don't know if you've heard. On the 17th and 8th of April this year, there was supposed to be a conference talking about international law and the State of Israel at the University of Southampton. It invited scholars from Israel, people of a variety of different opinions. Under pressure from Zionist organizations in Britain, British government ministers, with the support of opposition ministers in Parliament in this country, the Vice-Chancellor has just buckled and withdrawn permission for the conference to take place, on the basis that it is critical of Israel. No, that's not the declared reason. The declared reason is because of health and safety concerns, given that Zionists said that they were going to protest against the conference, on which basis, of course, this conference and this debate shouldn't be taking place either. That's what defending academic freedom means. It means getting behind those people, defending them and their right to speak and condemning that. I think that goes hand in hand with a boycott of the Israeli institutions that are complicit in the oppression of the Palestinians.
Okay, thank you very much to both speakers.